Hello, this is English 271, Introduction to Poetry, and I'm Dr. MHohner. I'll be your instructor for the course. So welcome to the class. If you look on our course Canvas site, you'll see a lot of information about me under the Meet Your Instructor page, so there you can learn more about who I am, but I've been studying literature and poetry for a long time, and poetry is just absolutely fascinating. Compared to other genres, it really is very unique and has its own way of being interpreted. So I am really looking forward to this class, really looking forward to getting to work with you and help you learn how to interpret poetry and really to seeing a lot of the writing you do and the analyses you come up with of poetry to see what your thoughts are on a lot of these poems that I've loved for many years. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Here's an overview of this first lesson. It's most of our lessons will be split into two parts. Usually we'll be covering two sort of subjects, or I'll have the poems grouped into like two categories. And so there'll be two parts to most lessons. I'm going to try to keep the lessons not too long, so they'll usually just be one video, hopefully about half an hour total, but it'll cover two parts. This one, there's only one part with readings. So this first part is an introduction and overview of the course. And then the second part will go through the readings, but even then it's still just a general introduction to poetry. The readings for this first lesson, I've just picked 3 songs. I'll talk more about that in a minute, but I think song is a great way to introduce people to poetry. And then one easy to interpret poem. So we'll look at those in the second half, but this first half, I'm going to give you just the basics of the course, the things you need to know to thrive and be successful in this course. So this first slide is tips for success in any online class. We're going to move from the general to the specific. So if you're taking other online classes, hopefully these tips will be helpful to you there as well. The first is to manage your time well. Online learning is just very different from a traditional brick and mortar classroom, and you'll usually have assignments due at different points, but you'll have flexibility typically in most online classes, including mine, of when you can turn those assignments in. So it can be really easy to put them off and then needing to ask for extensions. I strongly urge you against that. Try to get the work done on time and come up with a schedule where you reserve time to work on class throughout the week. So when you look at this online course or any other online course, see when the due dates are. For example, in our course, I try to keep it simple, and I'll say more about this later, but we're on an accelerated course because it's the summer session, so we only have 4 weeks. So we only have 2 assignments due each week, and they'll be due every Thursday and Sunday. I don't recommend that you wait and do them on Thursday and Sunday because they'll take some time. They'll take a few hours or more. But if you look at your work schedule, family life, hobbies, whatever you have going on, and say, okay, this is how long it takes me to do a lesson, and I'm going to set aside this time, these hours on this day, because I know I have that time to do the lesson with a little bit, hopefully a day or two before the due date, with with a little bit of time built in case it takes longer. So to do well in an online class, the benefit is that you have a lot of flexibility. Kind of the downside is there's more responsibility on your part where you have to really plan and make sure you have time to do that work. So if you just stay up to date on the due dates and reading assignments, and like I said, try to work ahead or at least set aside time a day or two before they're due to do them, you'll do great. My classes, I set them up in a way that they're hard work. You do have a lot of work to do, but there's no tricks, there's no gimmicks, there's no tests or exams. So as long as you do the work and you do it on time, it'll be really easy for you to succeed in the class. Okay, let's move specifically into this class. Like I said, there's only 8 assignments over 4 weeks, and 6 of those assignments are what I call discussion board or lesson assignments. And so I'm going to go over the steps of how to do those. Your other two assignments are papers that you'll write at midterm and the end of the course, and we'll cover writing about poetry when we get closer to those due dates. But for the 6 most frequent assignments, the discussion board lessons, here's the pattern they'll follow. So first is the reading. It's poetry. I'll say more about this in a minute, but you have to really plan for poetry. So take notes as you read. I'll say a lot more about specifically reading poetry in a minute. That's what the whole second half of this lesson is devoted to, but mainly with poetry, like you can look at a poem, for example, and it's 8 lines long. That will take you maybe 2 minutes to just read if you read it at a normal pace. You have to read poetry differently, so allow time for that. Watch these lessons. So the second step is watching the lesson. And, you can pause the lesson, take notes. Again, don't think of it as you have to just watch it straight through like a TV show, a streaming show. Pause it, take notes, do whatever you need to do so that the lesson informs you and helps you succeed. Poetry is very open to interpretation. So compared to some of the other classes I teach, the lessons in this class will actually be quite short. Like I said, I'm aiming to keep them to around half an hour or so. Some will be longer than that, but for the most part, that's the goal. Because I don't want to do too much interpretation. I'll do a fair amount of example interpretation to help guide you, but I want to leave a lot of it open for you for interpretation. So most of my classes with longer lessons are ones that are more historical based, that have a lot of background and context necessary to interpret the literature. There will be some of that here. We're going to be rooting our interpretation of poetry and its historical and literary context. But compared to other classes, there'll be a small amount of that. But there'll still be points where we're going over technical terminology or that historical background or things like that, where you'll really want to take notes, pause the lectures to take notes, really pay attention closely. Finally, studies show that if you write something down while you're reading it or listening to it, you'll remember it better. So keep that pen busy or that keyboard busy if you're doing it all online, but take some notes because you'll remember stuff better. And this model here follows what I ask you to do for each of those discussion board lesson assignments. Read the poetry, watch the lecture, and then answer the discussion board questions. And that's all you need to do. It's very straightforward. In some cases, like especially in lesson 2, you might want to watch the lecture first because I'll give some context that's helpful. But really what I'd recommend is reading the poetry first so that you get kind of your own take without any of my influence, and then reread the poetry after listening to the lecture so that you then can have it informed by the context I give. But I think it's great to come to the poetry without anything else informing you, at least initially. Okay, so like I said, for each weekly lesson, do the reading, watch the lecture, and then answer the questions. Usually there'll be 2 sets of questions, one for each part of the lecture, and you have to answer a question from each list. So you don't have to answer all the questions. You get to choose. There'll usually be 4 or 5 questions per list. You choose 1 per list, 2 total. This first lesson's a little different, and I'll explain that in a minute. On the discussion board posts I said, you got to do 2, 1 from each list, typically. Your initial response should be 250 words. So, like I said a minute ago, a lot of studies show that if you write something down while you read, you remember it better. So research really backs up the idea that reading and writing have a cyclical relationship. They influence one another. Reading will make you better at writing, and writing will make you better at reading challenging texts. So the best way, I believe, to evaluate you in a class like this is to give you writing assignments. So there's no test, there's no exams, but I do ask you to write a lot. I ask you to give an interpretation of a poem and then defend it by quoting language from the poem. and that should not take fewer than 250 words. Other classes I teach that aren't literature-based, 250 words would be a lot. If you're giving an interpretation of the poem and then defending it by quoting language from the poem, that is actually a small amount. And we don't have very many assignments, only 8 total. So 250 words minimum for each question. So that's about 500 words, about a page in a double-spaced document per question. So about 2 pages per assignment if you were writing double-spaced 12-point font. So that gives you an idea of what I'm expecting. You also need to respond to a classmate. This is to engage the part of the course where if we were meeting in a brick and mortar classroom, we'd be talking to each other. I really wish I could do more to replicate this because I think talking to other people about what you've read is the most helpful thing. But online classes are very convenient and we can only do so much. So I ask you to respond to a classmate, and that can be much shorter, 150 words. Now, 150 words still sounds like a lot for responding to a classmate, but I want you to really engage here, like I was saying. Don't just say, great job. Don't just repeat back to them what they said, although summarizing some of it in your own words can be helpful. Pose a question, something that advances the discussion. What is not required by grading, but what I'd love to see is people going into the discussion board and even responding beyond that minimum 1 post to a classmate per lesson. You have to answer 2 questions. You only have to have 1 response to a classmate. You don't have to have 2 responses to classmates. So really getting in there and talking to each other, I think that will just help you with the reading and make the class more fun. But those are the minimum requirements to encourage you to do that. The grading is really straightforward. I don't quite treat the discussion board as a completion grade, but if you do the full amount of words, if you give an interpretation of the poem, if you quote from the poem, and then you have an explanation, logical reasoning of how the quotations from the poem support your interpretations, you'll get full credit. And that's basically the same thing I'm asking you to do on the papers. And I'll grade the papers much more thoroughly, but especially early in the course, I will give you feedback on your discussion boards to see how well you're defending your interpretations from the quotations from the text to help prepare you to write your papers. But as long as you meet those minimum requirements, you'll get the full 3 points per question. So each discussion board assignment is worth 8 points. Well, lessons 1, 2, 4, and 5 are each worth 8 points total. 3 points per question and then 2 points for responding to a classmate. And then to make the math work well, and because they're a little bit more substantive assignments, lessons 3 and 6 are worth 10 points. So in those, the questions will be worth 4 and 4, and the response to a classmate is always worth 2. So you'll, like I said, if you give your interpretation, defend it from the text, you'll get the 3 points. And even if you don't defend it well, I'll still give you the 3 points, but I'll give you that feedback on how to defend it better to help you prepare for the paper. If you do the assignment, but you don't quite meet all of those things, then you'll get either 1 or 2 points. And then obviously, if you don't do the assignment, or if it's just way off topic, really lacking, it would be 0. So hopefully that's pretty straightforward. I am really open to hearing from students. I love communicating with you, getting to know you over email, or we can even meet on Zoom if you want to talk through something. So please take advantage of my office hours. My office hours are just anytime. Send me an email or Canvas message, and I'll answer the question. Or if you want to talk, we'll use email or Canvas Messenger to set up an appointment to talk. But I would love to talk through any questions you have, especially about the feedback I give you. But hopefully this is pretty clear and straightforward. But again, if you have any questions on the grading or the discussion boards, how they work, please reach out and contact me. Finally, just some things you should know. This class moves at a really fast pace. Not only is it a summer session, it's a 4-week summer session. So it's 10 weeks of assignments and content condensed down into 4 weeks. Now I give a little bit less than I would if I were teaching it on a 10-week, regular school year period, but it's still a lot of work. So you got to really look ahead, look at those due dates, stay up on things. Like I said, there's 8 total assignments. There's one due every Thursday and one due every Sunday. There's 6 lessons, which are the discussion boards, and then 2 analysis papers at midterm and the end of the quarter. So we have 4 weeks. So the first Thursday, lesson 1 is due. The first Sunday, lesson 2 is due. The second Thursday, lesson 3 is due. The second Sunday, your first paper is due. I really want you to have what I just said there vivid in your mind. So pause the lecture if you need to, but that means that your midterm paper will be due 2 weeks after the class starts. If you fall behind, email me. I am open, depending on circumstances, sometimes to giving extensions. But the 4th Sunday, when the final paper is due, is just 2 days before final grading closes on EagleNet. So if you get behind, even if I give you an extension, I can't push things out too far. I want to be really upfront about this in case you feel for any reason like this timeline would not be conducive. I think I've taught this class a lot, or this type of class, on this 4-week time period, and I think the schedule I'm describing here I've come up with is the best way to do it, but through trial and error. So you're getting the best version of the class. But if you feel like that's not manageable, I suggest you just drop the class and take it not on a 4-week session. So keep that in mind, and especially for that first paper that's due, you'll only have 3 days between lesson 3 and that paper. So I'm really going to encourage you in my announcements and in these lessons to start planning writing that paper earlier. You may want to do lesson 3 earlier if you can, or at least look ahead at lesson 3 to see if there's any poems in that lesson. It's a great lesson that would be ones you'd really want to write on. And then finally, compared to the other 2 main literary genres, fiction and drama, poetry is very technical, which is why it has its own introductory course. We don't do intro to fiction, we don't do intro to drama, because poetry is really unique. I think that makes it really fun to study, but that means we'll focus heavily on terminology, things like metaphor, personification, simile, metonymy, synecdoche, irony, paradox, things that are really unique to the language of poetry. And then we'll focus on sound. Most of the readings I've given for you, you can listen to out loud. And then meter. We'll actually get into counting the number of lines, syllables, things like that. So those are all important parts of poetry, and I think they make poetry really fun to study. It makes it a little more complicated to study, and you end up spending a lot more time reading the number of words there than you would that number of words in any other context. But what poetry can do, what it can communicate through its sound and imagery and language is powerful. So I really think you'll enjoy this class. But just remember that compared to some of the other genres, and especially fiction, which is the most popular genre right now, it's very technical the way we study it. Okay, so let's get into some of that technicality. So we're going to look at some foundational technical concepts you need to understand for reading poetry, and then I'll do a really brief sample close reading to illustrate that for you. So every poem has a dramatic situation, and that dramatic situation involves 3 elements: who, which is the person speaking, to whom, which is the person listening, and under what circumstances, the context. So poetry creates this dramatic situation, and in every situation of every poem, there's a speaker, a listener, and a context. It's important to remember that the speaker or persona is often different from the author. If you're writing about a poem, don't make an assumption that the speaker and the author are the same person. So if you're writing on William Blake and you quote the poem, Blake says this, say the speaker says this. But later when you're making ideas, you can argue Blake communicates the idea through the speaker, something like that. The auditor is the listener. So sometimes it's really clear who this is. There are poems out there where the speaker is really clearly speaking to an intended audience, but most of the time this won't be clear. But remember that poetry is meant to be heard. So there's a listener in mind. And that, again, like with the author, that's separate from the audience. So you and I are going to be reading these poems. That doesn't mean that we are the listener. Within the context of the poem itself, there's always a listener. Sometimes we'll know who that is. Sometimes we kind of have to interpret and figure out who that is. The context could be almost anything, a relationship, a physical setting, the time, so wherever the action of the poem is taking place. And that context is not always the same as the context in which it was written, just like with author or just like with speaker and listener. And on this note, I want to point out that in this class, we'll study poetry chronologically, which means the first lesson I've picked some songs and poems from different time periods, but starting in lesson 2, we'll start with really early poetry and we'll move forward with the final lesson being the most recent poems we read. And we'll look at different time periods like ancient Greece, the Renaissance, the 17th century, Romanticism, Victorianism, Modernism, the Harlem Renaissance, confessional poetry, these different literary movements and contexts to see how those shaped poetry, and we'll look at them in sequence, and I'll have readings on them that help you understand them better, and I'll flesh them out in the lectures. So it'll be a good, because it's an introductory course, it'll be a good kind of lesson for you in understanding literary movements, how they developed culturally, chronologically, how they move from one to another, and how the poetry fits into that. So for every poem, there's a speaker, a listener, and a context. That's the dramatic situation. Types of poems. There's 3 main types. Epic, which is narrative, dramatic, and lyric. So epic is narrative, which means it's usually in the narrator speaks in the first person, then other characters speak, and it tells a story. So if you pick up an epic poem and read it, it almost reads like a novel, but the language is still important. This is the oldest poetic tradition, so examples include the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, Beowulf, Paradise Lost. Those are the most famous examples. You can have shorter narrative poems, like, say, Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, or even Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. And then there have been epic poems written more recently, like the poem Omeros, which is kind of a retelling of the Odyssey by the post-colonial poet Derek Walcott. But basically, the characteristics of an epic poem are that it tells a story, and it's longer. And then, even though it tells a story, and especially a lot of those famous examples were written in other languages, like Greek or Latin or Italian. Dante's Inferno would be another one. So you have them in translation. So then they really read like a novel. But it's important to remember that they are poetry. And the original authors often told them out loud, so they needed them to rhyme. And if you were reading it in ancient Greek or Latin, it might rhyme, or there might just be other poetic sound elements that would make it really feel like a poem, even though it tells a narrative, if you were listening to that in its original language. So we've got to include narrative poetry in this class for our study of poetry to be comprehensive, and we'll look at the Odyssey in lesson 2. Dramatic poetry is usually much shorter than epic poetry, but it often still tells a story. So like Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven is the classic example I use because it's long enough. You could almost call it narrative poetry, and it tells a story, but it's very dramatic, right? And so dramatic poetry, epic and lyric's the third one we'll look at in a second. Epic and lyric are the most well-known, most widely used. Lyrics by far the most widely used, especially today. But dramatic's kind of in between the two. It incorporates a lot of lyric elements, but it usually tells a story or has something to it that breaks it out of just a traditional lyric sense, which we'll see in a second. In the Victorian period, which we'll study in lesson 4, was really famous for this because they had the dramatic monologues where poets would take famous people from history and speak in their voice. Lyric poetry is the final one here, and it's the most well-known one. So what you're probably thinking of poetry before your exposure to this class is like a short, 10 to 16 line poem where the speaker like describes a flower or a cloud and how it makes them feel. That's a very generic description. I didn't do it justice, but that's a lyric poem. So like a short poem that uses very poetic language to treat a subject. Um, and in most cases almost never tells a story. Maybe in some cases a very short story. There are other types, such as odes, ballads, elegies. We'll look at the example of an ode in lesson 3. An elegy would obviously be lamenting someone. A ballad is a good example of dramatic poetry because it usually tells a story but is nowhere near as long as epic poetry. But these are more like subtypes or subcategories. Epic, dramatic, and lyric are the main three. But, and this is important, these are genres or types. It's important to distinguish that from poetic form. Like in lesson 2, we'll study what a sonnet is. A sonnet is not a type, it's a form. So that's why it's not listed here. And we'll get into more that distinction more in the next lesson. But as a quick example, like you could teach a whole class on the ode. One of my colleagues does that, but the ode would still typically fall under the broader category of lyric poetry. So epic, dramatic, and lyric are the three types of poems. Okay, here are going to be my tips for reading short lyric poetry. This is a really important slide, so you want to probably take notes, pause it. I want to say this clearly, because if you look at some of the lessons for this class, there are a lot of poems under like some of them will have 12 or 14 poems. Again, we're doing a condensed, accelerated pace, but that's not very much reading, because some of those poems might be 8 lines or 4 lines or 12 lines. And so if you just read the poems for this class at the normal pace that you would read a story or an article, you'll completely miss out on the power of this class. You won't get out of it what you need to. So let's use an example by comparison. Let's say you were taking a class that focused heavily on fiction. Let's say, I know we don't offer an intro to fiction class, but let's say hypothetically there were an intro to fiction class and you were taking it on a similar accelerated pace. I'd probably ask you to read like 4 short stories. In each short story, taking notes, close reading would probably take you at least an hour or a little more to read. So let's say it took you 4 to 5 hours to do the reading for a lesson in a fiction class. I really want you to spend the same amount of time, 4 to 5 hours per lesson. Even though to just read the poem straight through at a normal pace would maybe only take you an hour or half an hour. Spend time with each poem. And here's how I suggest you do that. And again, like when you read the Odyssey is really the only exception. That you can read more like a novel. But for the short lyric poetry and the dramatic poetry, which is like 90% of what we're reading, read the poem once at a normal pace. Just read it through the way you normally would to get a feel for the language. Then read it a second time. This time read it out loud, slowly. Poetry is meant to be heard. A lot of the textbooks for a class like this have the word sound in their title. So you really want to hear it. And a lot of the ones I've given you have a recording you can listen to on the webpage. And as you learn more about poetry, you'll get more of a sense how the rhythm for it works. But even just trying to do it out loud and going slowly, some of that rhythm will come through. Now for this next one, poetry, because of the poetic language and the terminology we're going to look at on the next slide, it often sounds like a foreign language. So I want you to treat the poetic sound as a foreign language, and I want you to interpret or translate it into English. So after reading it a few times and at least once or twice out loud, write down notes. I say in the margins so you can print these out. You can write notes on your computer or tablet, or you can just have a notebook, as you're reading them. But write down notes and try to go not just a few notes like you would if you were reading a novel for a class, but Try to go line by line and put the poem in your own words. And then read through your paraphrase of the poem, and then read the poem again, at least one or two more times, out loud slowly. So let's say you have, 12 poems in lesson 5, for example, and they're all short lyric poems that are 20 lines or less. Spend 20 minutes on each poem doing this, and spend 3 hours, 4 hours total on that lesson so you really get the most out of the poems. Finally, try to sum the entire poem up in just a few sentences to get a sense of its unity. So for your notes, do notes line by line, but then at the end, try to sum it up in one or two sentences. Finally, in like one sentence, what is the meaning or the message of the poem? So point 6 there is kind of like summary, like what is the poem about in one or two sentences. But then with that last one, jot down a few things about your interpretation. Like what is it saying? So again, that's how I recommend reading poetry anytime you read it to get the most out of it. And I'm really asking you to do for this class. I know it's on an accelerated pace, but that is the time you would commit to this class normally. Just poetry so short, you can look at it and think you don't have to do that, but I'm really encouraging you to get the most out of that. Give what I just described here a try. The last slide before we look at an actual text is on figurative language. So I gave you a handout on figurative language. These are terms, a lot of these terms could come up in fiction or other genres, but they primarily come up in poetry. I'm not going to go over them all. And a lot of times I'll give you contextual readings or readings that help you understand the poetry. Read all the readings all the way through because they'll really help you understand the poetry better. But I'm not going to go over every word of them in the lectures because that would just make the lectures crazy long and crazy boring. So here I've picked, I think, about 5 or 6 terms that are quick and easy to describe. Some you may be familiar with, but probably less familiar with some of the others. And so this is a good example of how I'll go over context typically in a lecture. But here, with the figurative language, these are terms, types of words or phrases that could be in other genres, some, but are really specific to poetry and used a lot in poetry. So what poetry does that makes it so powerful and beautiful, you have an idea or an emotion, and the author wants to express that, but just telling you in clear, plain, direct language wouldn't convey the dramatic effect that fully captures their emotions and their ideas. So they use this kind of figurative language to express the idea or the emotion in an unorthodox way. And that's what makes it, like I said on the last slide, like another language that you then have to interpret. But through that interpretive process, you get the writer's ideas or emotions, and then it's an enriching experience. So here's just a few examples from the handout of types of words or phrases that authors use to do what I just described. But read the whole handout, and I'm actually going to ask you in both your discussion board posts and your papers to use these terms. When you're quoting the poems to defend your interpretations, use these terms. So hyperbole. This is an exaggeration. We actually do this all the time in plain language. Where we say, oh man, that blew my mind. Your mind didn't actually blow up, but that's how big the idea was. So poets exaggerate things all the time. A metaphor, everyone probably knows what that is. Figure of speech refers to one thing by another. Metonymy is probably a little less familiar. It's where you substitute one aspect or attribute for the whole. So like calling the sea the deep. Synecdoche and metonymy are very related. Synecdoche is where a part stands in for the whole, like saying all hands on deck, where hands means everyone from the whole ship. So metonymy is not necessarily a part for the whole. It's like you say one thing and it evokes the idea. You say the deep and everyone knows you mean the sea. Whereas synecdoche is more of a part standing in for the whole. Personification is where you take a non-human thing and give it human characteristics. In irony, I love irony. I'm going to use in my example close reading, but it's where what is happening on the surface is different from what's happening beneath the surface. So it seems like one thing is going on, something else is actually going on. Now, culturally, we tend to say like you just avoided someone. You pretended not to get their text, and then you see them at the grocery store. You might say that's ironic. That's not irony. That's a cultural misuse of it, but that tends to be how we use it. Irony is mainly a literary term, and it means, like I said, where what is really going on is the opposite of what seems like it's going on. And you'll see an illustration of this in a minute. So, quick examples of figurative language. Read the handout fully. It's going to seem like a lot of information at once, but as we read poems, you'll start to be able to apply these terms, and I do want you to apply them in your writing. Okay, so for lesson one, we have 3 songs. I picked songs because everyone loves music. I picked songs that are pretty popular, probably fairly well known, but have strong use of language and strong use of poetic language. So most songs are actually poems. These songs are very good poems. And then I included one poem by William Blake, The Chimney Sweeper. It's a good, I think, first poem to get you started because the meaning is fairly clear. And if you know the cultural context that children used to have to go inside chimneys and clean them out in 19th century and 18th century England, it's pretty easy to interpret, but it still really uses poetic language. So you get a soft introduction here with 3 songs in one poem. And what I'm going to do here is an example of the type of reading I'll do in other lessons where I'm just going to do a little bit. I'm only going to go through the first 3 verses. The song has 5 verses because I don't want to do too much. I want to leave lots of room for you to interpret yourself, but I still want to give you an example. So here we go. And this is the kind of close reading I just asked you to do on the tips for close reading slide. So I'm going to do a verse, and then I'm going to kind of sum up what it means. And as I go, I'll slowly incorporate more poetic terminology and get closer to the meaning of it. So the first verse, he says, "Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again, because a vision softly creeping left its seeds while I was sleeping. And the vision that was planted in my brain still remains within the sound of silence." I can't sing for you, but I tried to read it in a way that you've probably heard the song or you should go listen to it, that you kind of get the idea of how poetry is meant to be out loud and how you can get a sense of the rhythm for it here. So this first verse really has to do with context. Remember, speaker, listener, context. So here the speakers is describing the context. This poem is kind of an example of dramatic poetry, or this song is, because it's like a lyric poem, but it tells a story. And so he's describing a situation here that sets up the rest of the song. He has this dream. A vision came to him while he was sleeping, but he doesn't say a vision came to me. He says a vision softly creeping. That's where you get the poetic language to describe it. So I'm taking that, putting it into plain language. In the vision that it left its seeds. It's not quite personification, but almost. And then that means that the vision that was planted, it's still there, right? So he has this dream, this like crazy vision, and it stays with him. So that sets us up. That means the rest of the song he's going to be fleshing out what that vision is. And it still remains within the sound of silence. So we have the title. We know that's going to be a recurring theme. Okay, so we keep going. Verse 2. "In restless dreams I walked alone, narrow streets of cobblestone. 'Neath the halo of A Street lamp, I turned my collar to the cold and damp, when my eyes were stabbed by the flash of a neon light that split the night and touched the sound of silence.'" So this verse continues to be kind of contextual setup. He's now taking us into the dream. So it's easy to listen to this song because it's used in movies so much, the melody's so beautiful, to not really pay close attention to the lyrics, but the lyrics are amazing. So that's why I picked it. And if you pay close attention to the lyrics here, maybe in a way you haven't before, you'll see that In the first verse, he basically says, I had a dream and it stayed with me, and it was this vivid vision. In the second verse, he basically takes us into the dream. He says, in restless dreams, I walked alone. So the whole thing, as you read or listen to the other 4 verses, it all happens within this dream, right? It might be easy to miss that it's all in a dream unless we're doing this kind of close reading. There's the importance of close reading. And then, so it's still kind of setting that up. It still hasn't described the vision yet. So what we have here is now we're in the dream. So we know that the description of the vision is coming soon. And then we have, again, the language brings us back to the sound of silence. So that's that repetition. Repetition is very important in poetry. And specifically the phrase that his eyes were stabbed by the flash of a neon light says that we're probably going to get the vision, finally get the description of the vision in the 3rd verse or stanza. So now there's some dramatic tension. It's kind of building up, and we're really ready for that. Okay, verse 3. And then the naked lad I saw, 10,000 people, maybe more. People talking without speaking. People hearing without listening. People writing songs that voices never shared, and no one dared disturb the sound of silence. So here we get our first description of the vision, like I said. And what is the vision? It's people talking without speaking, people hearing without listening. So he uses irony. There's the poetic term. Because people talking but not speaking, they're hearing but not listening. They're opposites, right? There could also maybe be a paradox. I have to think about that a little bit more. But that goes along with the title, the sound of silence, right? Silence doesn't make a sound. So he's using that irony, that paradox, to convey an idea. And the idea is the failure to communicate, right? If people are talking but they're not speaking, and they're hearing but they're not listening, people aren't hearing each other. They're not listening to each other. They're missing each other. And now we can bring in the cultural context a little bit, right? This was the 1960s, a time of war and protest, all kinds of crazy stuff going on, not unlike the world we live in today. And so people fighting each other, hating each other, right? And so he's saying there may be a lot of sound happening, but no one is really hearing each other. We're not communicating with each other. And so he's got a vision he sees in his dream of all of this, all these people, but no one is getting each other. No one is understanding each other. No one is really communicating with each other. So I'm saving the last 2 stanzas because I would love to read interpretations of this poem, but that's what I would say the message is. So you just saw what I'm asking you to do through these 3 slides. Me summarizing what happens in the poem as I went line by line, verse by verse, me using some poetic terminology, irony, and explaining how the poem uses that, and then me saying, this is the message of the poem, and referring back to, my analysis, my summary of the poem, and that poetic language to explain how the author, through the speaker, communicates that message. So that's what I'm asking you to do. I'm turning you loose here. Go hit lesson 1 and go do exactly that type of thing. So I want to end by going over the assignment for lesson 1, because usually you'll have 2 sets of questions and you'll need to answer a question from each list. Because this is the introductory lesson and the reading is so short, it's just 4 short texts, I can't come up with that many questions for them, obviously. So what I'm asking you to do is just this. Like I said, normally you'll have 2 sets of questions. So instead, pick 2 of the texts. So there's the 3 songs and then the 1 poem. Pick 2 of them. Even though I did some of the sound of silence, there's a lot more to do. So you can pick that one if you want, but pick 2 of them. So instead of 2 questions to answer, you're picking 2 texts. And do close readings of them following the directions I just gave. So do exactly what I just did. What you produce should equal about 250 words or more for each text, but summarize it, like what happens in it. You can go line by line if you want, if that gets you to 250 words. But also, what I really want you to have is some use of figurative language. It can be any of those terms from the handout. Like, for example, I used irony, but it can be any of them. And then give me what is the meaning of the message. Like what I said for the meaning of The Sound of Silence was that the irony of the sound of silence, which is an irony echoed by other phrases throughout the song, is a failure to communicate. So some kind of statement like that at the end of your post, but at the first, number of sentences before that explaining kind of your summary of the song, again, going from that poetic language to plain language in your own words. So just pick 2 of them and do that. You can do it all in one post. You don't have to do 2 separate posts. And so you'll get 3 points for each of those, 2 total, 2 texts. And then you also have to respond to a classmate, and that's the other 2 points, and that can be 150 words. Again, advance the discussion in some way. All right, that's it for lesson 1. I'm really looking forward to reading these posts and everything else you write this quarter, hearing what you think of these poems and hearing your interpretations of them, because I love reading and interpreting poetry, and the only thing that makes it better is doing it with other people. And reading your writing about it is the way we'll do that in this class.